Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Wicked Queer's Asian Shorts Q&A. I'm Jay, a co-programmer of this shorts program, and I'm joined by Sheen, who is also a co-programmer of this program. Filmmakers, do you guys want to do a quick intro of yourselves and your films before we start off?
Hi, my name is Nirav Bhakta. I'm the co-director of Halwa.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Jang Wang, and I'm the writer and director of Blue Suit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kailia, and I'm the director of Between Us.
Great. Thank you, guys. So to start off, what drove you to make your films? Why did you choose to tell this story? And you guys can go in the order of which you guys introduced yourselves.
So originally our lead actress, V Kumari, she used to play my mother in a lot of things, and every single time we got to a point where we were like, is this the same character as the previous film? And it was like the same thing over and over again for, an Asian American woman over 60 or 50. And so the starting point was like this frustration of lack of representation for her as an actor or as a storyteller. And the fact that our industry was only looking at her as a two-dimensional character rather than a three-dimensional, fully fleshed out, complex human being. So the starting point came from there. V opened up to us about a brief moment in her life about where she went through a moment of domestic abuse, and that also helped ground the film. And yeah, in terms of like the LGBTQIA identity of the film, a lot of that was inspired by stories within our community. Our film has a lot of social media within it, and I had always heard of these stories within our community where people use Facebook as a back channel to connect. And I thought it was really interesting because like they're able to be more free and open through Facebook Messenger rather than society and the kind of confides they live in. So there was a few stories within our community of uh, people from nearby villages who identified as either trans or LGBTQIA, and they connected on Facebook. So that inspiration combined with like the story, we started kind of moving forward with like what the story is, and all of a sudden we realized, okay, yes, not only do we not see an Asian American woman on screen over 50 who is complex, but we also never really explore her sexuality, her identity. And I thought that was really interesting because uh, that challenged us as filmmakers as well, our thinking. Like, why are we always putting these women in a specific category? Why do they just have to be this specific identity rather than uh, have this complex and rich life? So that was the basis for Hala.
So for my film Blue Suit, the inspiration really came from a moment in my own life where I started developing feelings for a friend. And in order to kind of process these feelings, I started writing. And naturally, I just wanted to write until I can kind of just get to the light at the end of the tunnel. And as I was writing it, I realized that we didn't really see that many coming of age, queer, Asian American stories between two friends and just trying to navigate what the next chapter of their life would look like. And that really was kind of like the foundation and basis for Blue Suit, where the main character, John, is just trying to just get his feelings heard and communicate that to his friend. But there's always that fear, like, will he or won't he reciprocate my feelings? And then also like he's moving away the next day. Like, is this just bad timing? And so I really find that, the major theme of Blue Suit is this intersection between what you want versus what you need. And what John wants is this relationship with Henry, but is that what he really needs in his life? And what Henry needs in his life? So we really get to just see and observe these two characters right before they step into a new chapter of their life, which I think oftentimes aren't talked about. And coming of age is usually thought of like younger, middle school, high school stories, but I feel like we're always coming of age. We're always growing, and especially queer folks coming out later in life, you're always learning more and more about yourself. So this is kind of all that, a conglomeration of that was the foundation for Blue Suit.
Well, it's so interesting hearing your backstories. I had a feeling that there would be really, a lot of personal feelings behind these films, and I feel like that really came through in both of your work. So thanks so much for sharing that. Similarly, Between Us is a story that went through so many evolutions, and which began with a time that I spent living in rural Japan about 10 years ago now. And during that time, I was kind of in an isolated region, and found really kind of a home, like a family away from home, among queer and trans folks who were making their own kind of spaces for belonging there. And I had never seen, I'd seen so few films that represented, especially experiences of trans men. They had so little visibility, and I found that there was so little conversation between those of us who are queer in North America, like having the chance to connect with local queer people, oftentimes because they couldn't be out publicly, and the spaces, where they would get together might have to be kept private. And so it was really, the idea first came to me several years ago before I was a filmmaker, and I didn't know how to make it come to fruition. And through practicing and working on many other films, I decided to go back to that region and to bring together my queer and trans community with this sort of seniors community that had also been close with me, but I had never sort of seen those two groups cross paths. And so we went back to this mountainous region, and I wanted to set it in the hot springs because it's kind of it's such a culturally important place in Japan where you go out with your coworkers, or you grow up going there with your family. And if your body doesn't conform in any sort of number of ways, it can be a really difficult experience. And so I wanted to make that a place of belonging and make that a place of conversation, bringing queer and trans bodies, into those spaces in a happy context, but then also one where, they're trying to work out things between them and the couple in this film. So for me, it was also really personal, a chance to go back to this place that I loved and bring kinds of people together that I thought wouldn't otherwise have a chance to connect.
Wow, I love how in all your answers, you can really feel the authenticity that really drives through all your films, because as programmers, we do appreciate that when we see films and we see their originality and we see their heart. And so hearing your stories of why you've made these films, it makes so much sense, because they really do come from a place of authenticity. They come from a place of community. And I think that really comes through. So thank you for sharing that. That's great. So on the other hand, thinking about some of the more challenging aspects of your film, as you were putting together, as you were producing the film, as you were writing the film, what were some of the challenges that you met, and how did you guys deal with them?
Challenges? What challenges? Uh, so we made this film with the intention of submitting to the HBO APA Visionary Short Film Competition. After having that conversation with V, I was like, hey, let's just make something. And then we saw the prompt for HBO Visionaries through CAPE. And we were like, well, this thing is free and I love free. Let's make it happen. We were originally supposed to make production happen at some point mid-October, or not mid-October, like earlier in October. And long story short, I had a personal tragedy in my life where I lost my nephew. He was a stillborn, and that kind of changed everything with production. And we weren't even going to make the film, to be honest. And if it wasn't for my co-director and my producers, um, they felt the importance of the film, and they decided to, like, that they would wait for me, that we would take the time to grieve and then start whenever we were ready. So production got pushed back, and because, as all you know, production takes a lot to happen in just a few days, even gathering multiple people. So we lost a lot of crew members because we had to change our dates. Um, I went through like 3 DPs to get to that point, and then we finally had our DP David Kirkby come on board maybe a day before actual filming. So by the time we got done filming, we had just a few, not even few, we had like a week and a half left to edit and submit to HBO. And so, like, literally we worked up until that midnight deadline to turn it in. We had no idea that if we had any chance, because it was really choppy. And long story short, as you know, it happened, and since then it's been a really huge blessing that this specific story about a South Asian American woman who also happens to identify as queer, who happens to be over 50 or 60, um, is now traveling around the world, you know, and in conversations about queer identity, in conversations about domestic violence. And I think no matter how difficult the production might have been, um, the message and the amount the message has traveled has been what's been most fulfilling about the experience. So I can't even think about the hardships anymore, because um, like, as filmmakers, we all have a certain purpose in life, right? Or a purpose as creatives. And I think when you get to a point where you realize that your stories are greater than yourself, um, like, the production struggles don't even matter anymore, because we all kind of hung on to knowing like the importance of that story, and because it was a personal story, um, there was already some soul there, and it, like, we had to do whatever we could to make sure that we got the job done, you know. And because we didn't have much time to even think about like our struggles. It was just like, push through, get through, and get it done. And we did, and I think that energy still kind of travels with the film. I mean, it's going to be almost 2 years come May that the film's been out. um, so yeah, those are our production struggles.
For Blue Suit, to speak onto that, our production struggles, I mean, I feel like you can't go into filmmaking and going into production without any type of struggles. If you've cracked the code and figuring out how to have 100% smooth sailing production, please let me know. I would love to know how you do that. But for myself, with Blue Suit, I personally found the biggest struggle being that, like I had mentioned earlier, Blue Suit was based off of something that happened in my own life. And when you're writing from a place of, as you said, like authenticity, and a place of also hurt and heartbreak and also joy and love, you also find yourself reliving those moments. And what happened in Blue Suit was about a year and a half to 2 years. And then I finally found the courage to fully finish the script. And as I was writing, I just realized, like, oh my gosh, like all these feelings I kind of compartmentalized for so long is kind of coming back into fruition, and placing myself back into these characters, into the mindset that I was in that point in my life. I can kind of see it as a writer and almost as like a third party, in that the hurt and the anxiousness and the feelings that you have to navigate through just liking an individual, and maybe they'll reciprocate, maybe not, but even if they did, they would move away, and like all these different factors. And I found that to be really challenging. And I was just like, I remember distinctly thinking when I was writing, like, does art have to always hurt this much? And sometimes yes, and sometimes the best work of art is it hurts. But I think what's beautiful about that is to be able to share that with the world. And in a way, this piece of film that has all of these different feelings also allows for space of release and space of resonance and relatability, that your experience is valid, and your experience, you're not alone in all of this. And also on the flip side, another production struggle that's a little bit more lighthearted is I just really wanted to find the perfect Henry, the perfect actor to play Henry. And if you've watched Lucy, Henry's kind of this massive goofball. And we didn't have the pool that we had was good, but I was looking for great. And I remember I rallied up my friends and I was just like, okay, tonight we're going to West Hollywood, where it's like our queer neighborhood here in LA. And we're going to hit the clubs. And when we go into these clubs, I'm going to hand you these pieces of paper, and you just flip them to random Asian men all across the club, and just saying, we are currently looking to cast for XYZ, please contact us. And that's what we did. We didn't find Henry through that means, but I just always think, what a funny night. We went clubbing in WeHo to try to find Henry, and that was one way that we had to be a little scrappy with our casting.
I so relate to what both of you are saying about, you know, just, I don't know how much of your person goes into the production, and just how difficult that is. I was also going to say that, you know, as difficult as the production itself is, the script writing phase is really like a painful, I don't know, bringing something out into the world. And part of what was tricky with this film is initially I had wanted to make a documentary about specific very close friends, and they needed to keep their identities private. And so part of what was difficult for me was figuring out, okay, like, what's the essence of that was so important to me, and how can that be translated like through other people's stories, and a collection of collaborating with, you know, different trans men across Japan, and sort of bringing that together into a story that still feels authentic. And it was really important to me to let the actors really shape kind of how the characters and how the stories were. And so Aaron, for example, the Canadian partner in the film, wasn't initially a queer character. And I think I was dying to make her a queer character, but I just like hadn't admitted that to myself yet or something. And so that, and it's such a pivotal part in the film. Now it's hard to imagine that not being there, but like it was through the casting process. It was like opening myself up to thinking about people who could bring something new to the story who I might not have considered for the role. And so Kai, who played Aaron in the film, approached me and said, I'm not an actor, I'm a DP, but this story feels right to me. And if you're open to it, then I'd like to bring this dimension to this character. And it ended up completely transforming the script. And I think, so for me, it's like, the amazing part about filmmaking is you have to balance, like there's a need for control, and you have to get so many things in order, and, you know, and directing it in Japanese and shooting in Japan and organizing it from afar was definitely a challenge. But I always feel that what always worries me most is like, am I taking care of my people? Like, do they have what they need? Do they feel comfortable in this space? And I feel like, especially, you know, at the hot springs, like there's no nudity in the film, but it's a pretty vulnerable piece. And so I feel like the biggest challenge was just making sure that, you know, it's like we have all the right kinds of people working on this film, and that we've really like done everything to allow people to feel comfortable to just come as they are. And so if anybody, I don't know, is an aspiring filmmaker who's watching this, this is my first fiction film. I've done all documentary, and let me say, you can figure it out. Like, it's very, very difficult, but I think if you don't, you know, if you have the time to let the idea develop, and if you just work with other really good people who you love to be around and who will push you a little bit to, you know, make sure that the project still happens, you can make it. You can make it. Yeah.
I just want to jump in really quick to something that stuck out in your answer was that taking care of your people. And I think that's like such, I wish like all filmmakers thought that way. And I think that's something that's really beautiful, especially for when we're creating stories and productions and films centering around narratives of marginalized communities, and protecting your people and taking care of your people is like monumental. And I just want to say like kudos to you, and just like I love that, and I'm all about that. So I loved it.
It also sets a tone for your set, right? When you're in a leadership position and you're making sure that everyone's taken care of, um, by simply just doing that and not being an asshole and just being kind and welcoming, you know, you're allowing your production to go a lot more smoother, because everyone is then invested into the story. They feel like they have a piece of the story with them, right? So yeah, I echo everything what y'all just said.
So my next question is, well, specifically more for Kylie. Kevin and Nirav, please feel free to jump in as well. But you mentioned earlier the sense of belonging within your film. And I wanted to ask if you could kind of talk a bit more about how you created that sense, or, you know, lack of belonging in your film, and, you know, why that is kind of an important theme and point for you and the community there.
Well, I think belonging is one of those things that, I guess just speaking for myself, I always just assume that other people have found a way to feel comfortable in the world. And then, you know, I'm left thinking like, oh, why haven't I gotten there yet? Like, why do I feel like I don't belong in this space, you know? And it's always, filmmaking partially for me is like discovering like, okay, nobody really feels like they belong at all times, and we're all just sort of figuring it out. And so it's really important to me to open my eyes to ways in which other people feel like they don't belong, and what is it that creates that, and what can we possibly do to reach across that divide. And one of the things that that I noticed about a couple of my trans friends in Japan was that belonging to them, I guess differently from a lot of my North American friends, wasn't so much about having a queer community to be a part of, but sort of as being recognized as sort of quote unquote no different from anyone else in their hometowns. And I think at first it was difficult for me to understand, like, what do you mean you don't, you know, you don't need your queer people? But it's like, there's something grounding them, something in the landscape that's grounding them there, a long family history that's grounding them there, and like many other reasons why people would choose to stay in what from the outside might look like a more isolating situation. And so I was so interested in, I don't know, exploring that side of the story about like why people in rural areas, like why that can be so important to them to stay. And then at the same time, I wanted to bring in a non-Japanese character who has clearly lived in Japan for a long time and who wants to be a part of that space and a part of the life there. And I thought that having a dialogue between them would just be so important, that, you know, for both of them to have the space to sort of just ask each other questions, because they both feel a sense of you know, uneasiness or lack of belonging for slightly different reasons. a white person in Japan also is going to have certain kinds of privileges. There's no doubt about it. And so to me, I just felt like if we could ground it in the natural landscape, that there's something kind of, I don't know, healing about the hot springs as a space for conversation, and that if we could just sit and spend time with these characters in a place like that, that we start to, I don't know, that anybody watching can start to feel how they might belong.
Okay, so my next question kind of touches on that too, because you mentioned one of the characters being a white person in Japan, being an immigrant. And that's something I noticed in Howl too, of the mother being an immigrant as well. Could you both kind of talk about how you chose to portray that immigrant experience? You know, what went into kind of the mindset of shooting and writing the immigrant experience in your films?
I mean, I grew up as a former undocumented immigrant, so when I'm writing my narratives, I'm not necessarily thinking like, "Oh, today I'm gonna write an immigrant story." Like, I think uh, I think when we're trying to portray these characters, it's mainly about um, this is just who they are. This is their day-to-day lives, right? It's not. Uh, I don't know if I'm making any sense right now. I'm so sorry. I had a brain freeze. Um, but in Halwa, you know, she is an Indian American woman, but it doesn't necessarily have to like yell that she's an immigrant. I think through her immigrant identity, we kind of understand what her past is. Maybe that's the only connection there. Um, and you know, she is in a foreign land, and what that experience has shaped her up to, and you know, technically she's in America, which is like all freedom, but you know, she's isolated in this house, and what is freedom at that point? Um, so I guess the immigrant identity kind of shifted from that in the film. Um, but yeah, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think what I guess one thing about the immigrant experience in Japan that I wanted to touch upon is the fact that you know, so many people are invited over there, I guess, to teach English and do sort of jobs that aren't very integrated into the society as a whole. And even people who have really high level of you know, of Japanese proficiency and everything, it can be really difficult for, I think, people to feel allowed to be themselves and feel like they can actually like get somewhere in the workplace. And so for me, Erin is somebody who clearly is like not meant to be an English teacher. And I think, but her sort of, her queerness, it's like it doesn't land there. And I found often, you know, my queer women friends, some of them wanted that to be like a part of their public identity in Japan. And oftentimes that would be sort of, people would just sort of think like, oh, but that's just like what Western women are like. And it's like they struggle to make that queerness visible, which is sort of interesting. Like the cues here that people might be reading would just translate differently in that cultural context. And so for me, that's kind of, I think, what she's searching for, like, how can I make this recognized and make that be okay in this place?
Kevin, taking up on something that you said earlier, you said that you talked about how actually in the process of writing your script, there was actually a lot of pain and a lot of processing. But that was actually kind of surprising for me to hear personally, because one of the takeaways from watching Blue Suit was that I think Sheen as well found it to be such a positive energy film. We actually found it incredible to see a film actually that was had such a positive representation of like the queer Asian American experience, because we had seen so many traumatic versions of that same story. So could you expand a little bit on how you got to that story and the way that finally became, in the sense that how positive it was?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that for you and Sheen, you both watched my film and just thought it was such a positive representation, and that brings me so much joy to hear. Um, and I think why I say it was like so painful is because, spoiler alert, at the very end of Blue Suit, John doesn't end up with Henry. And in fact, Henry ends up confessing that he has feelings for another person. And that in itself is really heartbreaking. And I think for me, because it drew this loose inspiration from my real life and what had happened in real life, um, I was heartbroken, devastated when it happened to me. And because I took some time after when it first happened in real life to finishing the script, I was able to observe that the overall story from a more objective point of view. And unearthing these feelings, I had to unearth, the motivations and the wants of John, and how much he really just wanted to be with Henry, and having to put myself back in that position where I have completely moved on. I was like, man, I was so sad. I was such a sad man. And to put myself back in there to write John was is hard. But at the end of the day, what I really wanted was just having that conversation of what you want versus what you need. And although this is sad, and it doesn't necessarily mean that this is over, in that in a lot of ways, at the very end of it, John's seeking of just like his yearning for Henry and to be in this relationship, although it wasn't what he had pictured, he is able to move on. And it's almost as if Blue Suit is a prologue to the rest of John's life. And I think that in itself is very positive and very beautiful, that John is able now to move on finally and release and breathe when Henry was kind of this weight on his life for so long.
So coincidentally, I just realized after looking at my next question that all three films here all kind of end with a similar hopeful, open, yet kind of still bittersweet ending. Guess it was a very interesting coincidence, but could, all of you, I know Kevin, you just spoke a bit about this, but could you speak a bit more about, about those endings, whether, what you were, was there that ending in mind when you were initially writing that script? Was that something that kind of organically came around later?
Yeah. To speak a little bit more about it is just, I feel like I'm a personal fan of bittersweet endings because I find that it to be really realistic in just how life can be. And that, like, what a way to like end a chapter of your life when you look back and you're happy but also saddened that you're moving on to this new chapter of your life. And I find that those moments can only be categorized as bittersweet. And for me, I found that in my ending with John deleting essentially his love note to Henry, and finally just moving on and stepping into his own, I find that to be a place where like we as a community, like a feeling that feels relatable, a feeling that like I didn't anticipate that, but I think I needed that in order to propel me into this next portion of my life. And I feel like that's why it ended bittersweetly, and not John just in a happy relationship with Henry, or to the flip side, not having a completely traumatic experience at the end. Because to what was mentioned earlier, I think we have enough queer trauma. And I think we just need some hope that at the end of a film, we can feel inspired to continue moving on.
To echo off of what Kevin just said, number one, it was really important for us if we were gonna, explore these topics of domestic violence or, gender identity, that we listen to people and to do our research right and to ask what they are, how they want to be portrayed on screen, and how do they want the audiences to leave with their portrayals on screen. And I think the biggest lesson that we learned was that, um, especially any women who face domestic violence, was that they never wanted to be seen as a victim. And for that reason, and especially again echoing off what Kevin said, because there's just so much trauma inbuilt with, like, especially having a queer Asian identity, it was really important to show some hope at the end of it, right? Just a little bit of hope. So whoever's watching this, because people do watch our films, even if they travel amongst film festivals, and even if one person watches it, that's still one person that could potentially identify with your film and really be moved to your core. And if you're able to have that impact on one person, you know, making the choice of leaving your film to end with hope is really critical and important. These film festivals are where a lot of our stories come together, and they make a collective impact, I think. Um, so yeah, in Halva specifically, it was really important for us that our protagonist Sujata, she leaves with hope, because she's lived this really traumatic life that's confined in her house. She doesn't go anywhere except for she travels through her memories, right? Or she travels through Facebook Messenger or whatever it may be. And there's always this, like, oh, what if, like, oh, life could have been this or that. Um, so for her to kind of finally have a breakthrough moment, and for her to take control of her life, um, is a significant move. Even though this is a very simple film, it's a significant message for um, women or men over 50 or 60, or anyone that identifies as queer, who, you know, may be in a position in society where they feel like they can't fully express themselves or be themselves, um, to take a chance on love, I think, really. And love is a really beautiful thing. And uh, our main character took that chance on love. Um, and even though it may seem like bittersweet, but she finally stood up to the man that's been abusive to her for God knows how long, right? Um, she would cake herself with makeup so he wouldn't have to see her bruises. So when she walks out in the end and she decides to take off her makeup on her anniversary night and bare her soul, um, she makes that decision to be defiant, to say that you don't have any control over me anymore. And when she finally picks up her broken iPad and, calls her lover, halfway across the world, she wants to make sure that her lover sees her for who she is, right? No makeup, no filter, no nothing. This is who I am. Take me for who I am. And I think that messaging is really subtle. Not maybe everybody was able to get that, um, but I think it's really important, especially uh, when you're exploring a queer identity, right? It's like at the end, the hopeful message is like, I am who I am. And when you hear the childhood sweetheart's voice over the phone, over Skype, um, you have affirmation that, okay, they see each other finally. And because it's a short film, it's like you want to leave the audience with something, right? Let the audience travel with their imagination of where these two go moving forward. Um, but yeah, that's why hope is important.
I so agree with both of you, and I'm so happy that you both made the deliberate choice to move in that direction. And that, you know, it's not because we couldn't think of a, you know, a conclusive ending or something, right? It is a deliberate choice to be like, no, we're gonna land on this note that like opens the door for the next chapter. Excuse me. And I think I always knew that I wanted to kind of land on that note with this film, but since this was my master's thesis film, and so my supervisor was like, I just want you to see how it would land with you if you did a version where they don't end up together. And she actually had me do this in the editing stage of the film, where she said, I want you to recut the film where the ending goes at the beginning, and we're like essentially kind of where they start with the conversation at the hot springs and it ends up that he still decides to go, or that he decides to go to the job interview. What was it? It was like something where like everything was in reverse, and then she was like, what if they don't end up together? So I was like, okay, I see it like as an exercise, like to try and go down that, you know, line of thinking and what that means. But I don't know, it just felt really wrong. It just felt, I don't know, it felt really wrong to me. And I realized when I tried to write it, I was like, okay, if they don't, we don't know whether conclusively whether they end up together, but if I write it that definitively like everything is over for them, what's like the point of what I was trying to say with the film? It's, you know, in that case, it would be something like, no matter how much we love each other and try to overcome our differences, we can't. And I think sometimes that is true. I mean, life does work out that way from time to time. But I guess I just couldn't bring myself to sort of go down that road. And I felt like, it, you know, that we do follow Kay a little bit more, we follow his story a little bit more in the film, but I wanted it really to feel at the end, I mean, even just with the framing, everything's, you know, it's very like symmetrical, and finally they have this sort of like equal weight of just listening to each other. And so that's always what I'm interested in as a filmmaker. And I guess on the flip side, the challenge is I find it difficult to write really, really like intensive conflict where one person comes out, you know, really, really wrong, let's say, in the audience's mind at the end of the film. I guess I can't really make that kind of film for some reason. Yeah, I agree that the hope is it's really important to me as well.
Yeah, thank you guys for choosing to make these films and with these messages. I'm sure that the audience members like us will really appreciate your choices. And so, speaking of the films, can you tell us more about your upcoming projects? What do you guys look to do next? What are you excited about?
I have another short film that's doing the festival circuit. It's called Thank You Come Again, which kind of explores like the South Asian undocumented experience. That one does not end on hope, unfortunately. But also I think it's important as filmmakers that like we do explore the other option too, right? And I think shorts are the best place to do that, is to really explore your identity and like the emotions that you want to play with, and just story. Like you really get to be innovative with what you want to do. So that's on the festival circuit right now. I am finishing a animated short film at CBS for the nonprofit School on Wheels. They tutor homeless children on Skid Row. Um, so that film, and I think this is becoming like a common thread with my work, is there's some sort of social impact with all my films so far. And the film will basically use to raise funds for their literacy programs, which is incredible. And beyond that, I'm currently almost done with my first feature. which is a whole. I mean, I'm sure y'all know writing is a struggle. So I have a first draft of my feature. I'm just now finishing it up.
Wow, I just want to say big ups to you. You're staying busy, and I am inspired for sure. For me, I'm continuing to write. Blue Stew is still in the festival circuit, and I'm just writing on a couple short films and really focusing a lot of my energy on writing a pilot right now, focused on Vietnamese businesses. It'll be a fun 1 hour dramedy. And so just working a lot on that and spending a lot of my time on those creative efforts next.
Well, our film, this is a premiere of our film, and it hasn't screened in Japan yet. And so what I'm really hoping to do is to go back there and, of course, to share the film with the casting crew. But what I'm also trying to do is organize a program of LGBT Japanese shorts that can play together. Because I'd love to connect with other directors there and bring our stuff together and then be able to screen that here and in Japan. So if anybody has a Japanese LGBT short who's watching this, please get in touch with me because I'm hunting for them right now. Similarly, I do have one other film that's out there right now called Rock in the Coffin. A very different film, a black and white animated film about conversations about death with my dad. And that's coming up at the Hot Docs Festival in Toronto soon. And next for me is some magical realism and fantasy, and I love sort of nature and ritual as they're big important parts of my film, like with Between Us, and so I'll be exploring that in a new context in an East Coast Canadian film that's sort of a fantasy folklore-esque project.
Sounds exciting. We look forward to seeing more of all your works. That's it for questions from me. Do you all have anything more to add for the audience? Rasheen, do you have anything else to ask?
No, that's it. That's all from me.
Last comments?
I would love to know for the other two filmmakers how your film evolved, I guess, from how you first imagined the project. Like, I think, you know, it's so different when you're thinking of it in the early stages in your mind, and then finally it's out in the world and it's like it has a life of its own. It like becomes its own thing separate from you. And like, what has that process been like for both of you?
I think like when we're conceptualizing Halva, it was like, oh, this is interesting, you know, this idea of social media and whatnot. And then because we kind of, during the actual creation of the film, it was almost like survival because like we didn't have any time left and or resources, so we just made the film. And I think after we made the film, we both, Gayatri and I, were just like, okay, it may not be exactly what we imagined in our heads. It may not, we may not have been able to execute that because we didn't have the resources to do so. So we just kind of let it go. And we honestly thought that the film would just like fall flat and nothing would ever happen with it. And I think this is just one thing to like a note for all the filmmakers that are watching. If your content is strong, if your story is strong, it will break through everything. Like it'll go past all the technical difficulties. It'll go past any mishaps you have in production or any hiccups you might have in your editing or whatever. Because the cut that we sent into HBO was a rough cut. Like when I'm saying it was rough, it was rough. Like it wasn't even color corrected. It was like it was a refined rough cut. And it was a big learning curve for me that story is everything, like absolutely everything. And they basically chose that rough cut to win prior to us even like finishing the film and sending them a nice copy for distribution. So it was just like great validation for me that through this process, if your story is strong, if your characters are strong, if you're coming from a place of authenticity, and if you have something to say with your stories and your characters, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter about anything else. And I think learning to let go is another big lesson learned, because we completely let go. Like as soon as we submitted it, we were like, that's it, we're not getting in, great. But the intention was we're going to submit it, and with the intention for representation, right? We made the film with the idea of sharing with the world that a woman over 60 or 50 can be complex, or a three-dimensional human being. So by the time when we got to the deadline, we were like, well, what do we do? Do we just like pull it and not send it in? Or do we send it in, and even if it's one or two executives from this cable premium place, um, at least they will get to experience an authentic Asian American woman who's over 60, who identifies as queer, who's complex, who's going through a very um, interesting phase in her life. Uh, that's all. You know, it's to educate people. It's to bring these characters to life in front of these people, so they recognize us. They recognize that we are human, right? Where I think the AAPI community we're kind of finally breaking those boundaries where we are fully fleshed out three-dimensional human beings. I mean, we have a long way to go in our industry for representation, but I think for us, what's in our control is our shorts, right? Your short, Kevin's short, like they're really important. Like because they're going to be going through these rounds at all kinds of film festivals, queer film festivals, Asian American film festivals, mainstream festivals, whatever it may be. Um, Sharing these stories is really, really important, not just for us or our stories or our personal attachment to them, but to the larger picture of culture. And I didn't really realize that until HBO happened. And I mean, I'm blessed and I'm privileged because we had that amplification through HBO Visionaries. Um, but I really realized and understood that, wow, okay, this film is traveling to certain corners of the world where it's dangerous to be queer. You know, like your life is at risk to be queer, or to even express that you went through domestic violence. And like the film became its own entity at that point. And I think for me, through whatever stage it was, conceptualization, writing, production, festivals, to like distribution and like an audience outreach, all through all these different like facets, it's always been about how do I serve the story, and how do I serve the story as it's evolving, right? um and it's important that we do these Q&As. It's important that you continue to share on Instagram or social media or whatever it may be, or be part of social impact initiatives. And again, because like, for example, Kevin, I've seen your film and it's incredible. Um, but because it has this like positive energy to it, that's really important. Like we barely see that in any sort of queer identifying film. It's important to show that, especially because it's an Asian American film, um, and how that travels and affects culture, right? Our films may be short films, but they're not too small to make an actual impact or change in society. That's my opinion.
Well, I think this question is, I really appreciate it. And it's funny and interesting because like I said, my scripts came from something that actually happened to me in real life. And the beginning of it, the first draft, I like vomit drafted this for Blue Suit. It was like 27 pages, ridiculous. And I would read it and then I would get notes, and then it was just like getting longer and longer. And I had to take a break from it actually, because I was just like, this isn't it. This isn't how I want to convey the story. And there were so many scenes, there were unnecessary portions of it. And then when I took maybe like a 3-month break, I came back, I did almost a completely different rewrite of the entire film. The last, I would say, 3 minutes of the film was always going to be there. It was something that I came into writing that I always wanted to keep, because that's probably the most accurate representation of what happened in real life. And everything else that followed it, I changed in the rewrite. And I think because of that, it allowed me a lot of, because my feelings were so raw when I initially wrote it, it then served as character motivations and pieces of information and backstory that allowed me to direct my actors and to tell them, like, this isn't in the script, but when I initially wrote it, I want you to convey this feeling as if you were running out of the car at this moment. That's how you feel, just trapped in this car when this reveal happens. And so it really lended itself in the story, and in a way it lives through the story, but through the character and what they're feeling in that moment. Another version of this was, easily Henry could have been an antagonistic character, could have been just like this hateful, like just jerk, but I really just wanted him to be this lovable goofball, because there isn't an antagonist in Blue Suit, and I didn't want that to be the case. I didn't want people to hate Henry. I wanted people to root for John and Henry to be together, and although it didn't end up that way, I wanted people to still be like, I get it, Henry, like, you're living your life, we love you, we hate that you hurt John, but we still love you. And that's what I wanted people to take away as well, that sometimes in these stories there isn't a villain, and that's life. And sometimes our biggest obstacles are ourselves, and how do we overcome that in order to start anew?
Hearing all your answers, there's a question that I really want to ask, and that's, as you were reworking through your script and reworking through your project, at what point did you know that your story was strong and that this was it?
For me, it's weird. It's hard to articulate that, but there was a moment by the end of the film, like when the last moment when she finally decides to call her childhood sweetheart. If that moment didn't like give me butterflies in my stomach, and not just after reading it once, but like leaving it alone for like a week and then coming back to it and reading it again, and if it still gave me butterflies, it was a good sign. And again, because we were like pressed with time and we didn't have much, a big window to really play, like instincts are really, really important, right? And I think any of the filmmakers on this panel, they'll tell you that there comes a point where your gut says like, okay, this is it. Like, we're not gonna go in and change anything again. This is it. Like, this feels right. The energy is flowing good here. All my characters have their motivations and their arcs, and that's it. And I think at some point it's hard to articulate. I don't know how to say it, but you just get a feeling and you're like, okay, I'm at peace with it. I'm ready to go.
I think I kind of like burst out laughing when you asked that question, because I always feel like as filmmakers, and I know for myself, I'm just a perfectionist, so I'm always tinkering, and I'm like, ooh, what if we said it this way? What if, instead of this, they moved this way? And so I was just like tinkering until the very end. And to your point earlier, it was just like, there will be a moment with your script that you're like, this is it. We got to go. We got to move on, because you'll have your story in pre-production, you'll have another story in production, you'll have another story in post-production. It will continually evolve. And I think for me, when I was able to read it and just read it not as the writer and not as the director, but just read it as what it is, and just to let my characters speak for themselves and just see that played out in my head, that's when I knew that this was the moment, this is it. It helped too that, you know, during my feedback sessions, I would get less notes. That was always encouraging. And I was just one of my friends who I really respect and a well-known director, when he read it and he just said, "This is good, you're good to go." I was like, oh, thank God. And that was just like such a sigh of relief. And I think both you internally knowing and getting the affirmation of filmmakers that you really respect, I think that's like a surefire way of saying like, go for it, go into production, because that's only the beginning of your journey.
I think just to add to that just a little bit, I think an important thing to know is like you can't be too precious with your work. And I think what Kevin was saying is like your film is, the story is about to change anyways. So it's like instead of fighting against that change, like go with the flow, right? Be open to what it's going to be like in the actual filmmaking process or in the post-production process. And I'm not saying just be completely open, like you got to go into some structure. But I think you have to like have an open mind, like a game of improv. So you're continually discovering new things as you're going. And a lot of people are resistant to like accidents that happen on set, or like if something goes wrong. Sometimes it's for your benefit, because like that's where magic happens. You're forced to create something in the moment. You're forced to make a decision in the moment that's probably coming from an instinctive or a place in your subconscious or your being where like this is like completely you as 100% as an artist that you necessarily wouldn't really bring out if you had a lot of time putting on paper. So also being aware of that, like beyond the scripting phase, even when you're filming, if you see something, like go for it, right? And a lot of this doesn't necessarily have to be in dialogue. Halva was a lot of just like you know, nonverbal communication, and that was quite intentional. Like we had a lot of dialogue, but we stripped it down and we made the actors just perform all that dialogue internally. So we still got the soul of like what they're trying to say, and allowing it to kind of evolve on set. But yeah, like treat writing and filmmaking like a nice game of improv.
I'll just say one quick thing to answer your question about how do you know, because this is less about like the details of the script and more about how do you know when you have a story that you know you need to put out into the world. And I think, you know, to some extent we start to, you know, as you start to write, maybe it's coming from a personal place and you feel that itch. But when I was at a really crucial point at the script and I had already sort of locked in, you know, the shoot in Japan and everything, I had a really important mentor come and tell me basically that she thought that I was doing an LGBT story to be trendy, and that if I was going to do a trans story, it had to be about problems in the bedroom, because that's what trans stories are about. She told me basically like that the story didn't really make any sense, and she didn't know what I was trying to say, and that she, you know, essentially had like a complete other idea of what she wanted the film to be, and didn't, admittedly, like didn't understand what I was trying to do at all, and had some really harmful ideas actually about what the film should be like. And I think, you know, maybe we're lucky and we can like mostly surround ourselves with people who get it and who support it and who aren't trying to write harmful LGBT stories, but every so often you will have somebody like in a really important position who's giving advice who might try and like push you off in that direction. And I think, you know, that's when you feel that arrow to the heart and you're just like, that is the wrong advice for this project. That's not going to take me in the direction it needs to go. And I think you'll know that in your gut if that happens to you. And, you know, somebody else can always give you notes about, you know, change this bit of dialogue there or something else like that. But I would say, yeah, just don't let somebody take the core of the story away from you that you know should be there. Because yeah, as both of you have said, like so much will change. You know, you can refine everything in production, and you know you'll get there and you'll grow as a writer. But yeah, you'll know in your gut when you have to make a certain kind of story.
Well, we're glad you all followed your gut. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your vulnerability, your honesty, and honestly, your inspiration. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I think this is a wrap in terms of timing, but we hope the conversation continues and we hear from you in the future. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. I loved this program. I loved your films. This was really an amazing premiere. I'm so happy to be here. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. This has been so awesome. Love just being in this space.
I echo all the thanks. Thank you so much.